for so many people, government really is not an entity to trust. But when they see people who occupy places of government and they see themselves and they see their own communities represented, then they understand that, yes, these people, this agency is going to care about my issue. And I know that not only because they're telling me that, but because they're actually from my community.
New York City Commission on Human Rights Chair Carmelyn Malalis and Filipina Pride. Hello and welcome to Jannelle. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thanks for having me, Jannelle. It's great to be here.
Can you take us through your public service journey? Because, you know, Filipinos, we're in this stage now where a lot of Filipinos are wanting to run for office, wanting to serve in public office, but it wasn't always like this.
Well, I have to say too, it's very exciting to see more Philams in public service in different positions. Certainly here in New York City, and then of course, you know, across the country, also seeing friends like Rob Bonta in California. Very exciting. For me, this is actually my first time really in public service. After law school, I clerked for a federal judge for a 1-year period, as do a lot of people who graduate from law school. But beyond that, this is actually my first time in government. For me, public service is incredibly important. And I say this on a day like today. We're here in New York City. It is also the day for our primary elections, so such a reminder of how important public service is. I really wanted to think about, you know, entering into a role where I really knew I could bring my professional experience to bear, as well as, you know, my personal experiences to make sure I was really bringing something to the role. And, you know, in 2014, the appointments team for Mayor de Blasio called me up and they said, you know, we are familiar with your background and your reputation doing plaintiff side employment law work, workers' rights related work in that space. And we really want to talk to you about your interest, you know, to see if you have interest in leading New York City's Commission on Human Rights. You know, up until that time, frankly, the commission did not have a reputation of being incredibly active. My response was that I really wanted to be in a role where we could transform an agency. We could make it, you know, a preeminent place for civil rights and human rights. And they said, that's fantastic. And that's basically what led me here. I wanted to bring not just my professional experience doing civil rights and human rights related work in the private sector, but also just my personal experience in life to the human rights work that I know needed to be done here in New York City with such diverse communities.
You have been a staunch advocate of diversity and inclusion in different communities, right? And you mentioned that your track record speaks for itself, but how difficult was it to get to the place where you're at now as a woman of color, as a Filipina, and also a member of the LGBTQ community?
You know, it's interesting. This past year, as I'm sure everyone has heard, you know, across the country, we've sadly seen increases in the amount of anti-Asian hate violence and hate crimes, you know, around the country. And it has really prompted in many communities a conversation of how people experience anti-Asian hate and othering in different areas of their lives. And so it's also been a period in which I've really reflected also on the different ways that as a child, as a young professional, as a young person, I've experienced it myself. And so, you know, when I think about the question that you just asked, some of these experiences, of course, you know, come into play. I remember that the first time as a new lawyer, I appeared in federal court. You know, I walked into the courtroom and the judge turned around and said, we can start now because the interpreter is here. And, you know, I turned around and I was looking to see who he was referring to. And at the same time, you know, the person who ended up being my opponent in that case was kind of just laughing on the side. And I think about that moment a lot because I think about how I entered into that space already at this disadvantage, where the judge, the person who was in charge of that venue, had kind of just cut me down in front of my opponent. And those sorts of that's a very stark example that I pull out quite often, because it was my first time in federal court, and it was, you know, such a clear example of being misjudged and being, you know, misunderstood just because I was Asian American. But things like that throughout, I think, throughout my career have happened. And as I, again, in this past year, as I've had the opportunity to reflect on these instances with other Asian American and Pacific Islander attorneys or other folks who occupy positions of leadership, the stories are just so similar, you know, of in different ways being cut down or dehumanized because of your racial identity, your ethnic background, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. So, so I think there are many experiences like that to pull from.
Right. And so, what would you tell people? I know there's a lot of discussions now, microaggressions, things like you've had to do, whether it's direct or indirect. What is the best approach, do you think? Do you correct them in a similarly aggressive manner or firm manner, or do you brush it aside or try to make light of it? Like, how did you address that situation when you were in there?
I think it's going to require different approaches for different situations. And certainly the people who are involved may also require different positions of power, right? So in that situation where I was a new attorney and I was entering a venue where the person who had misjudged me, you know, no pun intended, was actually the judge who would then be I would have to argue in front of for my case, and I had to think about also how something could affect my client. In that situation, I had to very respectfully, once I understood that he was referring to me, you know, correct the judge and say, actually, I'm here, you know, representing the defendant in this situation in a very respectful manner. And I generally think that being respectful is the way to clarify situations, to correct people on things. No one likes to be embarrassed. Nobody likes to be humiliated. One of the bedrock principles of human rights work is really making sure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. And that certainly includes people who make mistakes about misjudging people. We can't expect people to change their attitudes, their preconceived ideas, their assumptions, if they're being humiliated into doing so. People have to reach that from a place of, you know, affirmatively wanting to do it because it's the right thing to do. And so, you know, I talked about different positions of power and being able to do different things. Nowadays, you know, where I am asked in many instances to be part of different panel discussions or different programs, you know, one of the things that I always talk about with panel or program organizers is making sure that they're having diverse panels or programs, including representation from different, you know, different genders, different races, different ethnic backgrounds. And so in many situations, if I realize that I am the only person of color in a program or a panel, you know, I let the organizers know that they have to diversify, that I will not be the sole or the token person of color in that panel or that program. And I do it in a very respectful way. And I think it's a very effective way that people think about, oh, we need to do a better job at securing more representation and more diversity. I mean, especially in a space like New York City, where there's a great deal of diversity to pull from.
You're also this navigating life, you know, as a person of color, you mentioned, but also a member of the LGBTQ community. What's more difficult in this time?
You know, I don't know that one is more difficult than the other. I think what has been wonderful is the way in which the conversation in the past few years has really been focused on intersectional identities, right? And I could be at a program or at a rally for LGBTQI related issues or rights, And one of the things I say is that we are Black, we're brown, we're Muslim, we're Jewish, we're Arab, we're everything, right? And so we look at any of these issues. If I'm looking at what my challenges are as an Asian American woman, it's still very much entwined with the fact that I'm a lesbian, or vice versa. And I think that also just helps us push human rights generally forward in a more equitable way. Because if we're not looking at one group versus another, or one issue versus another, we're realizing that, why are immigration issues important for LGBTQIA communities? Because there are so many people who are grappling with immigration issues who are LGBTQI identified, just as one example.
And I like what you said, highlighting intersectionality, right? You're not just one person in a box. You're in many different things, and that is all encompassed in the issue of human rights, the issue of civil rights. And if there's one message you want people to understand now about human rights, about civil rights, what is it? Something that to keep in mind all the time.
It's a common paraphrase, which is that, we are not free. We do not have human rights until we all have human rights. And so the striving for equity and equality and fairness, it is not just the pursuit that we have as philams. It's not just the pursuit that we have as, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folks. It's not just the pursuit we have as immigrants, right? It is the pursuit that we have to take on together. Because if we allow human rights to be contracted in any of these areas, it opens the door to allow human rights to be contracted in every area.
I love that message. It's good to be reminded, especially for our Filipino viewers, right? Because we all have, even Filipinos have our preconceived notions about different things, about different groups of people. What would you tell to them? What would you tell your parents, your relatives, your aunties, titos, and titas?
Yeah.
What do you always tell them?
Jannelle, it's funny that you say that, because as my staff here, very often, I'm oftentimes thinking of my parents and my titos and titas when I'm thinking about how do we message different things, especially again in a space as diverse as New York City, where we have such large and thriving new and old immigrant communities. The messaging, how we message, the process of messaging is just as important as the message we're doing, the substantive messaging, right? That's why one of the reasons that we've prioritized language access, for instance, at our agency. When I first got into our agency, we had something like 9 languages spoken across our entire staff. We now have over 30. With the recognition that, feeling or experiencing any sort of discrimination or harassment, it's deeply personal. It's deeply personal and it's traumatizing. And we need to remove any barriers that we can to make it easier for people to report and to tell us about what they've experienced. And I think what I would tell to answer your question, what I would tell to my parents and what I do tell to my parents and my relatives is to remember that the experience of discrimination or harassment, whether it is because you have an accent, which is something that a lot of my relatives, including my parents, experienced and continue to experience since being in this country, or it's because of how you look, or any one of those issues that they have experienced, the feeling of feeling different and feeling belittled, that is the same experience that people have if they are feeling discrimination because of a religious reason, because they're wearing a yarmulke, or because they're wearing a hijab, or because of their race, or because of their sexual orientation, because they're holding hands with the person they love, or because of their gender identity, because they're transgender. And we really need to think about, is that the way we want our communities to exist? Do we want to live in communities where people have to be worried about being who they are, expressing who they are, their true selves? Sometimes one of the things I talk about with my family, where I've talked about them in the past, especially when I'm talking about the way that discrimination or harassment is experienced or manifest in LGBTQIA communities, is I go back to when a lot of them first came here, You know, a lot of Philams my generation, we do not speak Tagalog. We are not Tagalog. We are not fluent Tagalog speakers, right? We may understand it, I understand it, but we don't speak it very well because a lot of our parents who came in the late 60s, they experienced discrimination because of their accents, and they didn't want their children to experience that as well. So they always spoke to their children in, I mean, you're nodding, I don't know if you've heard this story many times or if it's a personal family experience that you know, but this is true for a lot of Philams my generation. So in some ways they were hiding a part of their culture, right? And that is how, you know, in different spaces, especially a lot of LGBTQIA people feel, right? I remember when I was first coming out as a teenager, and in different spaces, it was a very different time than it is right now. You know, here in New York City, the protections that we have are broad and they are great, right? Against discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression. For me, growing up in New Jersey in a suburb, that was just not the case. And there were situations where maybe I had to hide the fact that I loved another woman or that, or who I was. And again, that feeling of hiding part of your identity, it is painful, and it's memorable. And I think that if I liken that for some of my relatives to hiding, you know, the fact that they spoke Tagalog, or having to hide other parts of their cultural or ethnic identity in order to blend in, people can understand more why, whether we're talking about, you know, language and race and culture, or we're talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, it still manifests in a very hurtful way.
Thank you for that. That's eye-opening, right? In so many words, I think it all points to empathy, right?
Yeah,
Education,
absolutely.
education, because when you educate, it builds empathy. That's what
And,
yeah.
and that's exactly it, you know, when you put yourself in someone else's shoe, because the reality is, at the end of it, we realize there's so many ways that we are alike. There's so many ways that we do experience, you know, harassment or discrimination. They might be because of other bases, but the feeling is familiar to people, right?
Right. I love that. You know, you're an example of a Filipina that has broken barriers, breaking barriers. You found your voice and you're using your voice. What are you most proud of?
I am certainly very proud of the work that we've been doing at this agency. I'm very proud that, you know, as we've grown this agency, when I first came to head this agency, we had a staff of about 55. We now have a staff at about 130. And it's an incredibly diverse staff. It's very representative of New York City. And one of the reasons I'm so proud of that is that, you know, there are already so many barriers that people have to contacting government. For some people, government has meant oppression, it's meant unrest. You know, in Philam communities, there's some folks who came to this country at a time of martial law back in the Philippines, right? So for so many people, government really is not an entity to trust. But when they see people who occupy places of government and they see themselves and they see their own communities represented, then they understand that, yes, these people, this agency is going to care about my issue. And I know that not only because they're telling me that, but because they're actually from my community and they understand the things that I've been through, you know? And so time and time again, in the last, you know, 6+ years that I've been here, what we've really tried to do is champion some of the communities that may have experienced long-standing discrimination, but maybe have not felt seen by government or heard by government. And so, you know, in the context of in 2015, there were something like, you know, over 22 anti-trans bills being introduced around the country. And that's when we stepped out with probably some of the most far-reaching legal enforcement guidance on how we protect transgender communities here in New York City. At the time when there had been, you know, Me Too had gone viral across the country. That's where we stepped out and we did our own citywide public hearings on sexual harassment. And again, explaining how the law under New York City is interpreted and enforced in a much more protective and expansive way than it is under federal law. At a time when immigrants were being attacked, you know, in 2018, we released legal enforcement guidance, making it very clear that harassing people because of their national origin, their race, their religion, or their immigration status, that could also be a violation of our law. So I think that there are many ways under my tenure, we've really tried to step up and say, these are the communities that have been under attack. Maybe people don't understand the enforcement mechanisms that are in place, but this shouldn't be happening. And we're standing up for these communities, and we're not going to tolerate this type of discrimination or harassment.
Such important work that you do. On the personal side, it is Pride Month, and you talked a little bit about coming out as a Filipina woman, right? And you know how difficult that can be, because mostly around the world it is accepted, but among Filipinos, we know that we're not as open still. What would you tell people that are watching right now that are maybe feeling still the need to hide that part of themselves?
In my personal life and in the different Filipino communities that I've been involved in, and in every family, there are LGBTQI folks. And, you know, growing up, there was also the understanding that a lot of times people felt like they had to hide. They had to hide themselves if they were the person who was queer identified, or in their family felt embarrassed, right? Like mahiya, right? If they had somebody in their family who was. And yet the reality is there are so many of us out there. And I will say that I think that the reason that I have been able to be successful in my career, the reason that I have been able to reach certain leadership roles in my career, is because I embraced that part of myself. And I embraced being who I am. I credit I credit being a religious person. Like, you know, my parents, the way that they raised us as Catholics, being in that faith, was to think about the people who are the most vulnerable. I think there's very few passages in the Bible that are repeated as often as the concept of to welcome the stranger, to help the vulnerable. And I really took that to heart, as did my parents. And that means also yourself, embracing yourself and your full identity for who you are. But in our families, also embracing other people for who they are. But doing that and embracing that part of me, I think, has also enabled me to achieve the success or the leadership roles that I have. And so I encourage all families out there to think about that.
Thank you so much. Such an inspiring, although short conversation. We hope to have
short
time, but I'm really thankful. I'm really thankful that you were able to make time for us today.
Thank you, Jannelle, and happy Pride Month to you. And thanks so much for inviting me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.